Welcome to the PIO Podcast, a place for everything public information related for police, fire, EMS, and local governments.
It was a good learning experience for a lot of us that social media is not real life.
But we have to remember the media are very rarely a target audience. They're simply that conduit.
Our words have impacts on individuals, and it may not be positive. So just being thoughtful and mindful of the words that we speak.
I think what's so interesting about this position too, and this job and this profession, is that every one of us is looking for purpose, and when we find it here, that's it.
To know is that a crisis for one is not necessarily a crisis for another.
Hey everybody, just wanted to get on here real quick and ask everybody if they enjoyed our content, if they've listened to us, if they want to keep us going, help support the show. And you can do that by going down to the bottom of the show notes of today's episode and clicking the link and giving us a sponsorship or even just a one-time donation. That'll really help us keep this podcast going and keep us giving you new content. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy today's episode. Good afternoon. Today on the PIO Podcast, we have John Schwabish. He's a senior fellow at the Urban Institute and an economist, writer, teacher, and leading voice on clarity and accessibility and how researchers communicate with analysis, and the creator of the podcast, PolicyViz. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks for having me. Good to see you.
John, so for our listeners, just so you could tell us a little bit about your background and what you're trying to achieve with PolicyViz.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm trained as an economist and spent the first sort of 10 years or so of my career working for Congress. I worked for the Congressional Budget Office for a while. And then in my time working at CBO, I got interested in thinking about how we as an agency, how researchers more broadly can communicate our data in better ways so that people can actually read it and they can actually use it in their work and in their jobs. And so I started my one-man consulting firm, PolicyViz, about 13 years ago now. And at the same time, right around the same time, moved over here to the Urban Institute, where I'm also a researcher and data visualization specialist. And at PolicyViz, I do a lot of the same things. It's helping lots of different types of clients, researchers, agencies consider better ways how to communicate and collect and analyze and visualize their data. Again, with this goal of being, how can we get information into the hands of people who can actually use it? As opposed to the way, kind of data analysis has been produced for decades now. It's just buried in, reports and journals that are just inaccessible to people. And we know that data is so important now. And so how can we get that information out into the hands of people who can use it?
Yeah. And, you pose an interesting question, and this kind of goes into my next thing. Public information officers, they put out so much information, press releases, and they'll put out images or they'll talk about statistics when a crime's occurring, things like that. But a lot of times I've seen this before where they'll just put a spreadsheet out on Excel. They'll just cut and paste. Yeah. Why is it so important for PIOs not to just do the cut and paste and to consider how that visual goes out?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I would say, your audience in a lot of ways is similar to the people that I work with, right? Who tend to be researchers, economists, social scientists. What we are trying to do is to get information into the hands of people who can use it. So let's think about some of our key stakeholders. If you are a police officer or a firefighter, you are trying to get information into policymakers, but you're also trying to get information into the hands of other agencies, but also into citizens, right? So that they can better understand, dangerous areas where they can ascertain services and that sort of thing. So if we think about people who are not necessarily experts in data, how can we make that information available to them? And so one of my first sort of eye-opening moments with this was when I was working back at CBO, and some of my colleagues were working on this, big report, but it was for Congress. And the main exhibit in the report was just like essentially 4 pages of a big table that look like a spreadsheet, right? And it's like no member of Congress is going to flip through what looks like a spreadsheet. They're just not going to do it, right? And so all I did for that was take a whole bunch of the numbers out and added a bunch of small graphs to that table so that you could sort of just glance through it and see, okay, for this row or for this thing and this option, this number is really big, this number is really small. So you sort of get that overview glance. So if we think about, again, service delivery agencies, firefighters, police officers, those sorts of things, what sort of information can you provide that will be most useful to people who are, A, maybe not data experts, and B, are scanning relatively quickly, right? So what are they looking for, right? So what are people familiar with? They're familiar with maps. If I think about my neighborhood, I live in Northern Virginia. I know exactly where the police station is. I know exactly where the fire station is, but I know that because I'm thinking about a map in my head, right? That's my acknowledgement. Now, there are going to be people who want to see all of the data, right? They're going to want that spreadsheet. But I think what we always need to keep in mind are these different audiences, that the person who wants all the data, the fire chief or the police chief wants all the data, right? You can provide that to that person in that table format. But if you think about the chief of staff of the city council, you think about that citizen group or that individual citizen, what they want is just maybe the overarching view, or they just want that single number, statistic, fact that they can get quickly and grasp easily. And so we need to be thinking about how different people read, different people's experience with the data and with the topic, and of course with the graph type itself. So there's a lot of considerations here, but my recommendation to folks when they are thinking about improving their data work is to first think carefully about who the audience is. And once you sort of tackle that, a lot of things start to fall into place, because now you say, oh, we were providing this 4-page table to people. We know no one's reading it. Let's summarize it, right? We just need to give like a simple bar chart or a simple map or a simple number. And once we start to think about who the audience is, as I said, lots of things start to fall into place.
And, John, that brings up something that I was just thinking of. So you talk about data visualization, and I'm going to get into that and talk about the book in a minute. But a lot of law enforcement agencies now, and fire departments too, have a dashboard on their website that has a link to, whether it's officer involved shootings or it's use of force and so on, or just general crimes. And the crimes that people are exposed to, that doesn't always, it's not something that's easily explainable because it's a pin dot on a map and it's a date and time. But if you designed it where there were pop-ups that came up when you hovered over it, and it gave you, how many people were injured or were robbed in this neighborhood in the last 3 months or whatever it might be, it's probably going to be more beneficial. That's the way I kind of think the way it should be, but it's still not that way on most of those dashboards.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think when folks are thinking about creating their dashboards, you think about sort of like a shot spotter dashboard or stop and frisk sort of dashboard. As you mentioned, you have these little dots that are individual incidents or something like that. I think that there are a few things to keep in mind in addition to who the target audience is. You mentioned sort of pop-ups or tooltips. You click on the dot and more information pops up. That works well if you expect people to be using it on a desktop computer. If they're scrolling through it on their mobile phone, they're probably not going to be clicking on that. So if you think sort of for the mobile phone audience, who is the primary user? What are they going to be doing? For that user, maybe what you want to have in addition to that dot map where you have all those individual locations, you might have some what are called bands at the top. Bands are known as big aggregate numbers. So it's just like a number at the top, right? And so what you do in that sense is you give people the opportunity to see the overall aggregate number. And then if they want, they can dive in. So let's just think of this very simply. We've got, let's just say I'm outside Washington, D.C. So we've got a map of Washington, D.C. with dots with all the crime events or the fire events where I'm on my computer or I'm the police officer needs more information. I can click on a dot, more information pops up in that little tooltip. But if I'm just a citizen group or I'm just on my phone, just quickly looking at what's going on in my neighborhood, maybe what I want to see at the top are, 3 big numbers, right? Number of events or number of crimes in the last week, number of, percent change over the last week, or whatever it is, those 3 numbers at the top. And then maybe it gives me the opportunity to filter in, right? I can change the date if I want to look over the last week versus the last month versus the last year. But then it allows me to go in even further. And then I have this map, or I have a bar chart, or I have something like that. So like I said, the audience is number one, and then also thinking about the platform and how people use it. So are they using these interactive dashboards in their office on a computer where they have this big monitor and they can click and they can take their time? Or are they just scrolling on their mobile phone on their way to work? And if that's the target audience, if you're trying to inform the citizens or the general public, I think a lot of people think mobile first for that sort of audience, right? They think about the person who's just scrolling through. And so you need to think about it in kind of a different way, as opposed to, I think, kind of, Bob, what you're talking about, which is officers or firefighters or chiefs of police or other agency officials who are really diving deep into the data.
No, John, what I'm thinking about as a citizen, because that's what the PIO is doing. They're connecting with the citizen more than the executive. That's something that, I know that's what executive summaries are for, when you do things for your leadership and stuff. But I think you're right. I think in the sense of the dashboard, having those bands at the top, that's more effective for somebody that uses mobile. And since we know the vast majority of users nowadays, they are mobile, and that's where they're going to get most of their data. So now Absolutely. You're talking about a completely different way of dealing with it. And I don't think most agencies are set their dashboards up to work in a mobile format.
100%. You're absolutely right. They are, and most people do this. They are thinking about building their visualizations or their dashboard on the platform or the technology that they have in front of them as they're building it, right? So I'm on my computer hooked up to a huge monitor. It looks great there, so it must look great for everybody. But it turns out that most people are on their mobile phone, right? And so you do need to consider that. And I think the band is a great technique to really highlight the most important pieces and then give people the ability to dive into more detail. If I think about the last community group meeting that I went to, there was a presenter who had a bunch of slides. I could imagine that person showing a dashboard, but what I want to see is the overarching numbers. How are things going? How are they trending? How are they progressing? And now if I have questions about my block or my area, the speaker could say, I have that information. We could zoom in here and I can show you this part. So if you're thinking about citizens, you need to be thinking about their level of expertise and what they want and what they need and how it's going to help them, in this case, be safer or live safer or know who to call and how to access services. And that's not necessarily letting people dive into a deep spreadsheet, because I'm guessing a lot of folks who listen to your podcast are happy working in a spreadsheet, but that's not most people. And so we have to kind of keep that in mind.
And I think I go back to your experience working in the CBO. I remember something that was out several years ago. It was a big book, something you guys came out with, and it ended up in some congresswoman's lap, and they said, we have to pass this before we read it. And I'm thinking, wait, there's a problem there. You're going to pass something without actually reading what's in it. That's not good. So obviously there's some data that's got to be reviewed there, right?
Yeah, I mean that's the thing, and it's admittedly hard, right? Because you are often thinking about multiple types of audiences trying to interact with the same content, right? You've got the whatever, maybe different sectors. You've got a citizen group, you've got a mayor's office, and you've got a financial sector, and they're all trying to get all this information out of this one thing. And it's really difficult to do, and that's why the sort of kind of mantra has been for these dashboard type worlds of interactive visualizations is you give people an overview of the data, give them that aggregate number, that statistic, that quick story, and then enable them to dive in and go for the details. Let them filter, let them search, give them the information. Now, that's a different type of visualization than a lot of the stuff that I work on, which is here's an argument, here's a point, this thing is bigger than this other thing, and I want you to see this thing. There are different types of visualizations. Sometimes we are enabling people to explore, and sometimes we're trying to tell them a story. And there's one isn't more right or better than the other. It's just what we're trying to facilitate and enable people to do in our work.
John, let's talk about your book then. The book titled Data Visualization in Excel. What motivated you to write this book, and who is the target audience for it?
Let's take a quick break.
When you think about propaganda, you probably think about Kim Jong-un and his funny little haircut. And you'd be exactly right. The podcast, This is Propaganda, doesn't want you to believe that. They want you to question the ads you see, the news you read, the brands you love. What they don't want you to question is that they are advertisers themselves, peddling the same tricks they claim you fall for to make a living. If you need something to boycott, look no further than this show. Don't listen to This is Propaganda.
Yeah, so this is my fourth book in the area of data communication. The book just before this was on data visualization, sort of like your kind of textbook of data visualization, right? How to do it well, different types of graphs. And the question I always get from that book and in my classes and workshops and stuff is, okay, so I've got all these new graphs I didn't know about, right? I knew the line chart and a bar chart and a pie chart, but now I've got all these great graphs. How do I actually make them? What tools should I use? And there are lots of data visualization tools out there. They all have their own pros and cons. I'm a big user of Excel because a lot of the people I work with, everybody has Excel, everybody has Microsoft. And a lot of the folks that I work with are, maybe small organizations, small nonprofits, small government agencies. And that's the tool that they have. They have Excel. They know how to use it. They know how to get stuff into it and stuff out of it. So the goal of the book is to help people, even if they're an intro, even if they're a beginner into Excel, how to get data into it, how to know the basics of the interface, how to know some basic formulas that you need to work with your data, and then how to create great, effective visualizations in Excel. And it should be noted that I do hear lots of people who say, I would never use Excel for my graphs. It doesn't make good this or doesn't make good that. It's just a software tool, and it has its pros and its cons. I would never use it to create, a big dashboard, as we were just talking about. I wouldn't use it to create a big dashboard because that's not really what it was built for. But if I need a bar chart or another type of graphic for a report or for a document or for a slide presentation, Excel is perfectly fine for that. So what I do in the book is take people from the beginning, show them the basic graphs, and then show them how to push the boundaries. Because when you hit that insert menu in Excel and you get those, dozen or so graphs in that drop-down menu, that's what you can make by default. But there's lots of ways to sort of push the boundaries of Excel to create lots of other types of visualizations, some of which can be inherently better than those default graphs, and some are just more engaging. And sometimes, particularly when you're working with citizen groups, sometimes you need to kind of engage people. Like, how many bar charts can one person see over the course of a day? They need to be engaged. They need to be brought in. And so that's the goal of the book, is sort of give power to people who are using Excel to create better and more effective graphs in a tool that everybody has, and in some ways is kind of written off as this kind of default tool that can't create great stuff. But I think just with a little bit of tweaking, a little bit of know-how, and some smart strategies, you can really push the boundaries of what you can do.
Okay, John. So why is data visualization so important? You alluded to this in the storytelling. Can you go into detail on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've known for a long time that data is important, right? To understand the world around us, to gather facts, to gather information. And I think over the last decade, maybe 2 decades, it's just become more and more important, right? Especially over the pandemic, when we had so much health information was so important. Data is the currency, but not everybody knows how to use data. They don't know how to read data. And so how do we make it more accessible to people? And the way we do that is we make it visual. We as human beings are visual creatures. So how can we make that data that can be or can feel inaccessible to lots of different people, how can we make that feel accessible and still inform people, right? Still give them the information that they need. And there's obviously lots of ways to do that. And we've seen lots of growth in how the media is handling different types of data. We've seen technology change so that our computers and browsers are faster and able to handle more data. And I think it's just very clear that the more you can provide visual information for data specifically, the more your data is visual, the more likely you are to be able to inform people and to cut through all the noise and all the content that's out there to get that information in front of people who can use it.
Yeah, and I think that's very important because, a lot of times, especially legislatively, you're talking about giving information to people, and yeah, a law could be hundreds of pages long, and yet how do you make that easy for people to read unless you break it down into some more visually pleasing format? And we know most people are visual learners to begin with. And if you don't provide it in a visual format, they're not gonna do very well with it.
And I would also say, like, you or your organization might be and might need to create that 100-page report. Like, the idea of creating visuals isn't to replace that, right? It's to highlight or bubble up the most important pieces of information. Again, to think about the different types of people who are going to be reading or need the information in that document. So you don't have to say, we've written this 100-page report every year, and now we're just going to get rid of it and make a graph instead. No. What we can say is we still need the in-depth research. We still need the information, the analysis of our station, of our community, of our neighborhood, whatever it is. But then in addition to that, we're going to bubble up the most important pieces and say, hey, in this, Bob, you mentioned earlier an executive summary. Like, that's a great example, right? Like a 2-page, 3-page executive summary that adds a visual component to it so that someone can scroll through it and scan through that first few pages and get the gist of the report. That is broadening the base of readers to more people who now can better understand the information and understand the argument and the data. And that's just better, right? Like, all that's just better.
And now, a word from our sponsor. In today's climate, you need to be able to communicate, whether you're communicating to those you serve, your peers, or your constituents. Whether you're looking for professional development or to work with a professional, John Guilfoyle Public Relations has you covered. From crisis communications to website development, visit our website at jgpr.net or call us directly at 617-993-0003 to get started today. We'll help you tell your story strategically. Now let's return back to our episode.
So, John, public information officers, when they put information out, social media is kind of like one of those places they do. How do we use that? How do we put data visualization into our social media?
Yeah, I mean, the social media landscape is obviously changing pretty quickly right now. Twitter is kind of falling down a little bit. LinkedIn is sort of picking up the slack. We'll see what happens with TikTok. I mean, I think we certainly know that more visual content on all of these platforms does better. We know that, for example, if you have an image in your tweet, it's going to do better than just text. We know that. There's lots of studies to document that. So when it's time for us to think about, we're summarizing, let's go back to this report that we sort of imagined here. We've got this 100-page report. What do we want to do? We need to think about how to summarize that, boil it down to a headline, or maybe several, because now what we can do is thread things together, or we can have multiple tweets or Instagram posts or LinkedIn posts, and think about what is that image that's going to capture people's attention, right? And I guess the one thing I would say here is that the graph in the report or in the document or the website, whatever the sort of core content is, it doesn't have to be the same image for social media. So let me just sort of expand on that a little bit. I've published, spent my career sort of in economics, publishing in economics journals, right? When you publish in academic journals, readers of those journals, and for Congress as well, right? In my previous role, right? Those readers want to see that if this thing is 3% and this thing is 2%, they want to see that exact difference, right? Between those two values. But on social media, what's important for that reader, for people who are flipping through Twitter or Instagram, is that this thing is bigger than this other thing. The exact difference isn't the thing that's important. It's just this one thing is bigger than this other thing. So maybe in the report, I have your kind of standard bar chart that shows that exact difference. But on social media, I use something with a little bit more, maybe more color, a little bit more, maybe I throw some pictures in there. Maybe I use a visualization that's just focusing on the size difference. And so, I would just, as folks are thinking about their social media usage, again, think about what the goal is. The goal of that tweet or that post on whatever platform is to get people from there to the longer, more in-depth piece, right? If that's what you're trying to do, right? And so for the social media user, they're scrolling, you want to grab their attention. And if you're in the role of trying to get information out on social media, and it's not necessarily bringing people over to the report, how do you make it visually accessible in a scannable way, right? Like, how do you get it so that when I glance at it, I can say, oh, okay, there is an event at my local fire station on Thursday night, right? I want to be able to see that really quickly and move on. And so there are lots of great tools out there now, especially for design. The tool that I was just using before we jumped on this call was, I like this tool, Canva. Canva's a really nice design tool. There's lots of great templates in there, and it's really easy to just create nice looking stuff, and then you just export it out as an image file and you can drop it into your social media. So again, it's thinking about the user and the platform and what they are doing and sort of looking at while they're in that particular area.
Right. John, you have like 5 guidelines for better data visualization. Can you explain what those are?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'll try not to take us too long here because, So I've got these 5 guidelines that I think are useful no matter what kind of visualization you're creating. If it's a static graph or report, for social media, for a dashboard, for anything, I have found these 5 just to get me started. So the first guideline is to show the data, which sounds obvious. But a lot of people end up not showing the data, right? They hide it behind, icons or all this text, or they put a picture on top of it. They also might narrow their data down to the one thing. And so one way to think about this is, maybe you don't need to narrow your data down because you lose the relative position. Let's just think about what's a good one? Let's say aggregate crime rates across 30 cities. So let's say I'm the mayor of DC and I want to share data on the crime rate in DC, which right now is not great. What I could do is just show that one number. But the other thing I could do is show you a bar chart where I've got 29 cities where the bars are all gray and the one bar for DC is a different color. And so that pops out, that you can see. So now I'm showing you all the data and I'm highlighting the thing that's most important. So what I want to do is show the data. And that's step 1. Guideline 2 is to reduce the clutter. So most of the tools that people use add too much clutter, in my opinion, grid lines and tick marks and data markers and text all over the place. And all I try to do is reduce or eliminate all that non-data stuff. When you think about the stuff that's not the data, right? It's not the actual physical bar or the physical line, whatever that is, reduce or eliminate that stuff. The third guideline is to integrate the graphics and the text. And I think the one thing I will tell people here that they can do, ignoring really everything else, I mean, aside from knowing your audience, but the one thing that everybody can do is to think about telling people what they should learn from the graph in the title of the graph. I mean, I will tell you, virtually everybody I work with, when they write a graph, they just describe what's in the graph, right? Crime rate in Washington, D.C., 2000 to 2024. Whereas if I tell you the crime rate in DC is going up over the last several months or whatever the story is, whatever that point is, tell people what it is in the title of the graph. We know, we have evidence that people read titles of graphs. And so let's tell them what's going on in the graph. Don't be shy. I find so many of my clients will say, oh, I can't do that. I just have to have this descriptive title. And I'll say, let's look at the report. What did you write? Man, I'm telling you, Bob, like 99 times out of 100, what they've written in the text is like in figure 1, you can see that the crime rate is going up, right? But like there's just this breakdown before it gets to the dashboard or to the viz.
And especially when you're competing in time for people's attention.
Right, exactly.
The longer you have to make them read, their brain shuts off and they move to the next thing.
Yeah, I mean, why are we making people work? We want to show them this information, and again, not every graph has a single point or a single thing, but like way more often than not, you are using the graph to support an argument or make a point or give people information. And so tell them that. We know they're going to read it, so let's just tell them that. There are two other ones that I like to try. One is called, it's commonly known as small multiples. It's literally just smaller multiple charts instead of one big chart. So if you think about the made up example I have here of crime rates in 30 cities, right? Let's say over time, we've got this big line chart. It just it can look like a mass of spaghetti, right? So one thing we could do is break up that chart. Maybe we have 30 small line charts, or maybe we break them into, 4 smaller line charts by region of the country, or for the ones that are growing the fastest versus the ones that are going down. So it's just an approach instead of like trying to cram everything into one graph, just sort of breaking it up. And then the last strategy is a practical approach that I take with my work. I call it starting with gray. And what I do there is I make my graph. I've explored my data. I've made my graph. And then what I do before I'm done is I make everything on the graph the same color and the same weight and the same thickness. So now I've got these let's say these 30 lines on my graph, and they're all gray. I've got the grid lines are all gray. The axes are all gray. And it's impossible to read because everything's the same color. Everything's the same thickness. And so what that does is it forces me to make some conscious decisions about where I want your attention to go on the graph. I want you to pay attention to, out of these 30 cities, the crime rate for these 5 is going down. And I'm going to put those in, a nice sharp blue color. Maybe I make them a little bit thicker. Maybe I label those 5 cities, right? And so by making everything the same, it forces me to make decisions about how I'm going to direct your attention and where I want it to go. Because too often, we use Excel or we use another tool, whatever the tool may be. We insert the chart, we make the chart, and then we just publish it. And we just kind of think people are going to read it. But by forcing this starting with gray is just kind of a forcing mechanism on myself to make sure that I'm thinking about who the final reader is and what I want them to sort of focus on.
That's a great point to do it that way, because then it really does make you key in on that very specific information that you want the public to be aware of, as opposed to, just letting the chart create its own colors and stuff.
Yeah. And it is such a simple and powerful approach. I mean, literally, if you think about that chart we just mentioned, you have 30 lines. They're all gray, the same thickness. You have a legend over here, but you can't go back and forth because they're the same color. Okay. So now I have to say, okay, so what's important here? Like, what is the thing I want people to learn? Okay, well, I'm going to highlight just one city or 2 cities, whatever it is. And then I can be sure that people are going to see the thing I want them to see.
John, in your book, you mentioned discussing letting the audience needs drive your data visualization. Is that kind of what you mean, or is that something different?
No, that is kind of what I mean. I think what I sort of dive in that a little bit more. We've been kind of, it's kind of I guess a through line of this conversation is what does your audience need from you? Like, you're creating your graph or your dashboard and you're providing it to them. And what do they need it for? Like, help them understand why they should care. Like, why is this information important to them? As opposed to what I think most people do is they make a table or a graph or a dashboard and they just say, yeah, here it is. Go ahead. Like, I've got the data. And people sort of make this argument like data are neutral or data are objective. And that's just not true, right? I mean, aside from the fact that there's all this stuff that goes on to get the data, when we are presenting the data, we are making an argument. We are trying to get people to understand this aspect or that aspect or this fact or that fact. And so let's help facilitate that rather than just hoping that they're going to get it when we post it or we send it out.
All right, cool. John, a question about public information officers. A lot of times they're putting out crime information and they're using multiple crimes that impact the community. We talked about a geographic data on a map to improve the connection to the public. Is it important to do that, or should you break it down even further to be, maybe, I don't know, maybe this very specific crime, or is it important to give people an overview more so?
I mean, that's a good question. I would say it depends on a bunch of factors. So I guess type of crime, I guess that depends on a lot of factors, right? So if you're in a community where you don't have a lot of violent crime, but you had a lot of property crime, and maybe certain kinds of property crime, you probably want to make that clear to people, right? That, we don't have a problem with gun violence or murders in our neighborhood, but we do have a problem with, bike theft, right? So being able to sort of like peel those things apart, I think, can be really important. I think kind of the really interesting question that you raise is on the geography. And I'm guessing, like, I know I did some work in traffic stops in Chicago and looking at the difference between police beats and district beats, right? So police beats are much smaller than the districts. And so, I don't know the exact numbers, but like districts are huge. They're like combinations of, maybe a dozen different police beats. And so you kind of in some ways lose the neighborhood part of that. And I think the neighborhood, and this is just personally just thinking about my own experience, when I think about my interaction with the police or with the fire department, it's very personal and it's very neighborhood driven, right? Like what's happening on my very specific several blocks around my home is even, is the most important thing to me. And so if you're able to have those detailed data for people so that they can access it, I think that is going to be an important way to help people understand your data around crime or fire or other aspects of that. And you mentioned at the very beginning of this sort of a point map. I mean, a point map is a great way. You've got a point of an incident in your neighborhood and you enable people to go in and see it. And there's lots of tools out there that you can sort of combine different types of visualizations or different type of maps layered on top of each other. So maybe you have a visualization. I'll tell you about this one I did for Chicago. It was literally traffic stops by police beat. We had a detailed location, longitude and latitude, so we could see that. We aggregated up to the police beat level. And then from there, we aggregated up to the district level because the audience, the group that was wanted or had the data and wanted to see the visualization, wanted to see the data at those two levels. So when you come to this dashboard, you see this map of Chicago with all the police beats outlined and colors showing the number of traffic stops, sort of a shaded map of like light blue to dark blue. And then you could toggle between that map and the police district map where you have much fewer number of geographic areas, and again shaded by a different color map. So because we now, with these dashboarding tools and with data visualization interactivity, we give power to people to control what they can see. I think we should and can do that when it's possible. And I'm sure for a lot of your listeners, there's lots of data privacy and data security issues they have to deal with when it comes to a lot of this. But again, whether you can aggregate or disaggregate up or down a particular level, think about, my recommendation would be to think about, again, your target audience and what are they seeking to best understand? Is it their particular neighborhood? Is it a particular crime type? And to sort of facilitate that understanding and that interactivity with your work.
John, is there a question I should have asked regarding data visualization and as it pertains to PIOs that I should have asked? And if so, how would you have answered it?
Yeah, that's a good one. Well, we'll be here all day if I really go into it. But I guess maybe the question that folks are asking, we talked a little bit about Excel. They might be wondering about other tools, other data viz tools. So maybe I'll just real quick just tell you about a few that folks might want to explore. So in the dashboarding world, Power BI is the Microsoft dashboarding tool. So if your department is a Microsoft Office, if you use Microsoft Office, Power BI is included in the subscription version. So if you have Excel and PowerPoint and Word, Power BI is included in that. So you can just go to your Office suite and just turn that on and you can use it. And Power BI is really nice because it clicks right into Excel. So it's kind of, I think, more natural for a lot of people who are Excel users. The other big dashboarding tool is one called Tableau. They've just made some important changes in the last couple of weeks to the free version. So if folks want to try that, that's a really interesting one. There are two browser-based tools that I really like. One is called Data Wrapper with a W, and another one is called Flourish. Both of these tools, they're both in the browser, so your data go up into the cloud. So you just want to be careful about any secure data. But both enable you to create interactive visualizations and visualizations that work for different screen sizes really quickly and really easily. I like both of those tools for those kinds of work. And then if you really want to get into it, if you really want to get deeper, there are programming languages. Probably the three most popular right now are R, Python, and a JavaScript library known as D3. But I'll just say, like, I use all of those tools, plus a few others. And, I wouldn't get hung up on trying to find the quote unquote right tool, just finding the tool that's best for you and your organization. If you're a Microsoft Office agency and you're creating static bar charts for your reports, Excel is perfectly fine. If you want to move up a little bit into the interactive world, into making some dashboards, maybe just with your colleagues or working with citizen groups, Power BI is probably going to be sufficient. I wouldn't overthink that, but that's always a question that comes up is what tools to use. And there's lots out there, but if you're an Excel user, you can start there. And I would, try Power BI and try some of these browser-based tools that are relatively easy to use. They're just a bunch of clicking and figuring out, what works best and how you can sort of change the defaults and make things look the way you want them to look.
And I'll add all those into the show notes, John. Thank you.
Great. That's great.
John, rapid fire questions. Let's lighten this up a little bit.
All right. I'm ready.
Texting or talking?
Talking. I got too many grays.
Chocolate or vanilla?
That's a good one. So I'm going to go vanilla ice cream, but chocolate cake. So
there you go. Coffee, tea, or energy drink?
Tea.
What would be your superpower if you could have one?
Ooh, that's such a good one. Man, super speed sounds pretty good at the moment.
Yeah, I would like that one. Ask permission or beg for forgiveness?
Beg for forgiveness every time.
What place would you most like to travel to?
Ooh, wow, that's another good one. I would love to tour the Mediterranean.
Yeah, beautiful beaches.
Yeah.
Beautiful water.
Right? Yeah.
If you could choose to have coffee with any historical figure, living or dead, who would it be?
Oh, these are good questions, Bob, and I'm not being fast enough. Historical figure, alive or dead? You're going to make me pause and think about this for a little bit.
That's all right.
I want to say Alexander Hamilton would be good. James Baldwin would be a fascinating conversation. Albert Einstein. Oh, I've got too many. I've got to take some time with that one.
Okay, those are all good. Excellent. Final thoughts.
Who's yours? Who's yours though?
Mine, actually, it would be Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln.
Okay, yeah, that's a good one too. Yeah, I mean, yeah. Just a big dinner.
Yeah, exactly. John, final thoughts. What key points would you like listeners to take from the interview today?
Yes, great. Thank you. Well, thanks for having me. First off, think about your audience when you are creating your visualizations, your graphs, your charts, your diagrams, whoever it is. Think about what they know, their level of expertise in the data, in the content, in the graph, and make that as accessible as possible for them by thinking about who they are, what they need, what platform they're using, and how you can help them find those insights and do their job better or understand the data even better.
Great. John, how can people best reach out to you if they want to connect or follow up on anything they heard?
Yeah, folks can find me. My website, again, is PolicyViz.com. It's with a V-I-Z. They can find me there. They can also find me at the Urban Institute website. That's urban.org. And I'm all the social medias. So they can find me on LinkedIn and Twitter and Instagram. So,
and then we'll add all of that into the show notes. John, thank you very much for being on the show. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
That's all for this week. We hope you enjoyed this episode.
Thank you for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast to get notified on the latest episode. If you are listening on a platform that allows you to leave a review, please give us a review. Any review is appreciated. To support our efforts with the PIO podcast, you can click on the support button in the show notes, and any donation is appreciated. Thank you.